Hello and welcome to the Persuasion Lab podcast. I'm your host, Moeed Amin. The goal of this show is to help sales professionals primarily, but you don't have to be a sales professional at all. Really, it's anyone where persuasion and moving people is a critical part of your success. So we will cover some of the science-based elements, and we cover the bigger questions around sales, not just the regular sales tactics that people are always asking about, but what it takes to become successful. Success is not just about the skills or the knowledge you acquire, it's also about the person you become. So we'll be covering things like human behavior, body language, functional medicine. We even had an expert on functional medicine coming on, and various other aspects that will contribute to success, like personal brand development. And actually, one of the things that I have been hearing about from the community a lot more is, what does it take to build high performance sales teams? And specifically, what are the things that we should be teaching salespeople to value more than anything else that will help them develop into incredible sales professionals with incredible amounts of success? And that's why I'm delighted to have our next guest on the show today. So our guest has been in the sales profession for just over 26 years, and 22 of those years has been in martech. And in those 26 years, he's worked in recruitment companies, credit agencies like Experian, martech firms, and enterprise software. In fact, he was the EMEA head of marketing for cloud services at Oracle for over 6 years. And in that time, he spearheaded a radically different approach. In fact, this approach was so successful that he quadrupled their average order value within just 12 months. So what was this approach? Well, turns out what he did was actually change their sales approach to become more buyer-centric. So who would have thought being more buyer-centric would mean more sales, right? I'm keen to dig into that a bit more with him. So now he's on a new journey, and he's almost kind of 2 years ago, he founded Supero, where he helps martech firms and companies solve their talent, pipeline, and sales problems. So please, help me welcome someone who's also a father of 9, 6 of which are miniature Dachshunds, Mr. Alex Abbott. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be here. You missed just one point at the end there. So 2 of the 6 Dachshunds are pups of 2 of our originals. So I'm essentially a grandfather, well as one of my sons having a little girl. So to her, I'm grandpops or popsy.
Well, you just added 2 more, so that's incredible. So to have that many, and how do you look after them? How do you find the time? Because that's a big responsibility, right?
Yeah, it's busy in our household, you could say.
Do you delegate that responsibility a lot, or do you still take it on?
I have a wonderful wife who does a lot of the looking after the dogs and my granddaughter.
Oh wow. Okay, well, she sounds like she deserves a medal.
Yeah, for sure.
That sounds great. I'm always not surprised, but I'm always intrigued by how people manage both their professional and personal time, because people think they should be separated, but actually one can bleed into the other, particularly mindsets, right? So if things are affecting you in work, they can affect you in the personal life, and vice versa. And I know most people are going to expect me to ask sales related questions straight away, but I really wanted to touch on this point because of the sheer volume of people that are involved in your life. How do you approach the management between personal and professional? Do you see things bleeding into the other? How do you kind of not allow one to negatively affect the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. Where do I start? So years ago, I used to put my career before family. It took me many years to realize that family was actually far more important than my career. But what my family's allowed me to do, I should say my wife has allowed me to do, is focus 100% on my career. And so you know this more than anyone, I'm sure. Doing what we do and being successful in sales is not 9 to 5. Quite often it's 60+ hours a week and working weekends and working holidays. I've learned to balance that, but I think in order to be successful, you have to go through that yourself, and you need a very supporting partner and family to enable that.
It sounds like what you're describing is your supporting family and partner enabled you to have that mind share, that kind of headspace. It's not just about work. I mean, this is what I found personally. It's not about just the hours that you spend doing the work. It's actually almost that kind of freedom in terms of mind space and mind share, and kind of quieting the noise of those other responsibilities and freeing up that space in order for you to focus and be more creative and to think differently and to have different perspectives about what it is that you do and the value that you bring.
Yeah. Even the little things like, we'll get up at 6:30, 7 in the morning to take care of the dogs. They need feeding, they need to go out. But I have about an hour of time between sort of 8 and 9 where I start writing my articles and blog posts. And, my wife recognizes that. So immediately she'll just carry on doing what needs to be done, and it leaves me to do what I'm doing.
The 8 till 9, that's intriguing. So why 8 till 9? Why not later in the day? Why not in the middle of the day to do those blog posts and articles?
I find I'm most productive then. So I'd say I'm more of a morning person. So when it comes to my brain being most active and thinking clearer, or even exercise, I'm better at doing that in the morning. I prefer to do that.
So what do you advise salespeople to focus their time on in the morning, or when they are most alert, most awake, most active? Is that something you worked on with your teams when you worked with them in the past? What's your advice there?
I think everybody is, their own individual. So you've got to find your rhythm. So for me, that works. But, many people I've worked with over the years have their own times of day where they're most productive. Some people that's in the evening or late into the evening. But for me, it's the morning. And I would encourage anyone within my team or anyone I work with to find what works best for them, so they can balance their time, balance their energy to be as productive as possible.
And one of the things that I've been it's interesting you say that, because one of the things I've been discussing with other people has been the application of what is valuable work. And obviously this varies depending on your role, right? But when it comes to sales, and let's take new business sales as an example, there are various things that you can argue are equally important, right? So outbound activities or reaching out to new people to generate sales and fill your pipeline is considered important, but also constantly learning and reading about the industry, or especially your buyer's industry, reading and learning about the news and what's going on so that you can start to see trends and formulate strong opinions, learning about your product, right? So that you sound professional, you sound knowledgeable, and you build trust with the buyers. All of these various things can be considered as equally important. And it can be sometimes very hard for people to, prioritize and allocate more importance for one over the other. And therefore, it might be difficult for them to say, well, I'm most active during this time, so that's what I'm going to spend my time doing. Have you addressed such considerations with yourself and your team in the past? And what have you found work?
That's an interesting one. I can certainly speak from my own perspective. That may or may not highlight any shortcomings I have as an individual, but certainly for me, I've found that in order to be successful and perform at the highest standard consistently over many, many years, I have to have this sort of always on approach, this always on mindset. So, I will take time to switch off, and that's important, but I'll always be thinking about how I can improve myself, my own performance. That comes through reading things and learning and being curious and inquisitive. and then testing new things and applying that to what I do on a daily basis. But for my teams, I would say I've always put a lot of focus and care into the enablement of my teams, whether that's the first line managers or the reps themselves. You know, I think that's important because I want them to understand how to do their job most effectively. But at the end of the day, it's up to them whether they want to have the same mindset that I do. You know, I would encourage them to have that, because I do believe that's what's required in order to be, you know, most successful in sales. I don't think I've met someone that's, you know, highly successful in sales that doesn't have that always on approach, certainly in enterprise software and services sales.
How have you helped them, or have you encouraged them to apportion their time in the right way? Because obviously you will look at their performance, and naturally you want to, you know, if there are issues with that, you want to dig into why that's happening. And sometimes that could be because they're not placing enough time on the right things. Or, for example, you know, in their conversations, the quality of those conversations aren't up to standard because they probably lack knowledge or lack skill set or practice in a certain area. So how have you helped them decide where they should spend their time and on what activities?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, especially given certainly a topic I know you and I have touched on in the past around buyer behaviors and how our world has changed. And so, you know, I think it's very easy to be busy for the sake of being busy. I've done that in the past. But it's very difficult to identify what those high impact behaviors are that you should spend most of your time doing, because when you do them, you increase the chances of your success, or the probability of your success. So I'll give you an example. There are sort of 3 or 4 different behaviors that I as a sales leader have focused on quite heavily over the years, linked directly to helping buyers buy the products and services that we sell successfully. And it's down to defining what the problem is, helping the buyer understand, you know, what that problem might be, and define what that purchase criteria should be. And if we can do that successfully in sales and align that to our strengths, you know, we're more likely to help that buyer successfully buy the solution, the service. The next one, and there are really 3 of them when I think about it. The next one is shaping an evaluation process that will help the buyer successfully tick off all the boxes they need to, but also give us the opportunity to coach that buyer through any hoops that they need to jump through as they kind of, you know, move the ball along within their peers within the organization that they need to get support from. And then that leads on to the third, which is helping them build consensus effectively, which is really difficult to do, right? You know, we think it's difficult to sell. It's even harder for our buyers to buy what we're selling. And so knowing what they need to do and how best to convince their peers to support that purchase decision is key for us to spend time on as sellers. So I used to define those 3 things, plus many more, but if we keep it simple, I used to define those 3 things and build enablement and coaching around helping my sales team do those 3 things better.
So that was really interesting. So if I've captured that correctly, so the first one is, you know, understanding the problem and the purchase criteria. The second one is shaping the evaluation process. And then the third one is helping build consensus effectively. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. That third one, I want to dig into that because that's only going to get worse. Mm-hmm. Right. And from my own research, and I just sent out a first in a 2-part series to my community around the trends, the buyer trends that we should be expecting in 2023.
Yeah.
And One of which is, it's only going to get more difficult for buyers, right? And for various reasons, some of which there's a heightened sense of anxiety and fear out there at the moment, not just in sales and buying, but in the macroeconomic and the social structures at large. And that's only going to make people more hesitant. The acceptability of failure, or the tolerance for failure, is only getting lower and lower. Which means that buyers are more hesitant to make decisions that might be too far against the grain. They're going to have more people involved in the decision-making process. I was just on a deal with a client the other day. Well, not the other day, probably about 2 months ago. It was a £600,000 deal, but they had 37 stakeholders involved in the buying process, right? Wow. And so what you just said about buyers not really knowing how to buy is absolutely true, right? Some of them had training on buying, some of them haven't. Some of them have never purchased a product like this before, and therefore it's new territory to them. Yeah. And some of them, when you're working with diverse groups, have never really come together for something like this. And some of them don't want to come together because it's extra work for no extra pay. And they don't want to make a scary decision where their career is going to be on the line for this. So why don't we break this down? I'm really intrigued to see, to understand from you how kind of to best approach this. So what is your anatomy for helping buyers in that consensus group come to an effective decision?
It's a great question. I think we could spend quite a bit on this one. What I found, and there's kind of two parts to this. There's my experience and what we've done successfully as a team, or I've done successfully with my teams before. And then there's how things are kind of evolving and what we need to do differently to be more successful at building consensus in the future, given the way things are going. And so that first part, and around that purchase criteria that we touched on a moment ago, there's kind of two elements within that. One is first finding and qualifying the individual that has the influence within the organization, enough influence within that organization to convince others. And, as you quite rightly said, we're often faced with challenges like that individual hasn't bought a £600,000 solution before. They've only recently joined the company. So how could they have influence and trust with peers enough to get them to sign off a check for £600,000? And so it's critical that we qualify that individual first, and or individuals around that pain point, that problem, and we help define what that purchase criteria looks like. And once, and as we're doing that, we are qualifying the cost of doing nothing. Once they've accepted that actually this is a pain that I want to solve, I am willing to explore this further with you. We then start to link the unique capabilities of the solution that we're offering to that purchase criteria. If we haven't done that, there is no foundation to build consensus with the peers, because they'll all be thinking about their own agendas. And so it's vital that first step is done in my mind.
So this is, find and qualify the individual with the influence to help them convince others. And I love that you said that, because oftentimes in sales, we mistakenly think that we're the ones that have to do the convincing of everyone in that stakeholder group. But actually, when you think about it, that makes no sense, because they're not going to trust you as much as someone in their own camp. So what you should be using is using your champion, right, to help and get their commitment to convince others, and kind of coaching them to do so. So I thought that was really interesting that you said that. Define the purchase criteria and qualify the cost of doing nothing. So we're kind of going into status quo territory here. And this is something that's been talked about for years. I talked about it recently. I just interviewed Matt Dixon, who is an old mentor of mine, for his new book, Jolt Effect. And he talks about status quo quite a bit in there. Talk to me about how should a salesperson who is buyer-centric address status quo and communicate the cost of doing nothing?
So I've had a certain way of doing that, which, is directly linked to the martech industry. So, I think there are 3 or 4 sort of key components. And actually, before I get to those 3 or 4 key components, you talk about Matt Dixon. I'm thinking Brent Adamson and Challenger. That approach is something that I found incredibly valuable for me in my career, certainly as an individual contributor, because I found that it helped me put names on things that I was already doing, but also take me to the next level. The cost of doing nothing, you can start that conversation by creating commercial insight, right? That's a term that's used by Challenger, where you're packaging up information that will help that person, that individual, understand the commercial value of solving the pain that you've identified, but also the potential cost of doing nothing, and the effects on them and the organization. So, if you can build out that commercial insight and it's compelling, fantastic. In order to actually quantify the cost of doing nothing, though, it's those 3 or 4 elements that I was touching on. And so, it's key to understand what is the differentiating commercial value that you provide to your customers. If you don't understand that, you're never going to help your potential customer understand that. And if you can calculate that, you can then calculate the cost of doing nothing. And so, understanding what the impact is that you deliver. Number one, understanding what that path to value is. So, what are the things that you need to do from a marketing perspective, given that I've been selling martech for years? What are the things that you need to do on that path to value that will actually help you realize the value? But what is that value? How much money are you going to make by doing those things, achieving those milestones, walking those steps? And then what are the strategic levers and the benchmarks that you can assign to those strategic levers? And the strategic levers are really the things that you do as a marketer to accelerate your path to value, how quickly you can reach or walk that path, but at the same time, how much you can increase the sophistication of what you're doing at the same time. And if you, from a marketing perspective, it usually comes down to a few things. The data sources and how deep those data sets are, and the integrations that you can create. Because by doing that, you can then improve the depth of personalization in those marketing communications. And that is the biggest, that has the biggest impact on revenue generation. So if we understand those benchmarks, we can then quantify what the uplift is by pulling those strategic levers. And then we link that to the capabilities that exist within your platform or the services that you offer to build confidence on within the commercial value that you will drive over time. Now, if we model that, then we understand how much money you are set to make, or how much money you're not going to make, the cost of doing nothing in this case. And there's other things we can build into that in terms of the resources and the time.
I feel like we're scratching this, not scratching so, but we're talking now about how you helped your sales teams become more buyer-centric and therefore quadruple the average order value. And I'm going to ask that question in a moment, but in relation to what you said about quantifying the impact, right? And it's something that I think, is one of the things that separates high performers from average performers or low performers, is their ability to not only quantify it right? But to also do so confidently and communicate it in a way that they truly believe that that is the right number. And even if it's not the right number, you know, we're going to get to that right number, right? How should all that data come from you, or are there other sources that can help you quantify the impact and the value for a buyer?
When you say come from me, what do you mean?
So a lot of that may come, a good question. So a lot of that may come from you, the supplier, the vendor, right? Your own analysis of, you know, the impact of you know, doing nothing, or even taking another solution, right? And I'm just wondering, where do you get the data? You talked about benchmarks, you talked about specifically path of value and impact to delivery. Is that information mainly from you, the supplier, or are there other sources that you can, because I'm just trying to give salespeople here some practical ideas and methods for them to be able to take this to their own business.
Yeah.
And one of the big questions I get is, you know, not big question, but one of the questions I get is, how can I go about starting to quantify this? Because it's quite difficult for me to do so on my own. So should they get that from their company, from the people in their businesses that can help them do that, or there are other sources of information that can help them understand the quantification and therefore deliver it with more confidence?
Depends which bit, you know, which bit and where you are in the process. So the commercial insight that I spoke about earlier, anyone can create that if they know how. It's not necessarily easy to do, but in the simplest form, you can pull together 2 or 3 pieces of information that kind of build out the beginnings of commercial insight that you can use to then sort of teach your potential buyer a new perspective, but at the same time qualify whether or not they have the influence to drive the purchase process forward. And I found quite simply, you know, if we have an industry known problem, right? So we know it's a problem for everyone, that we just don't know how much yet because we haven't yet spoken to them. But a really good example, certainly for marketers, is testing and optimization. It's a problem for everyone because it requires effort to do it successfully. And so you're quite safe leading with that one. So by bringing in a case study that you might have, or some independent research. It's probably a bit old now, but you know, for testing and optimization, Forrester used to talk about the fact that 9 out of 10 marketers don't test consistently. There's only 1 in 10 marketers that test consistently, and those that do see a 25% increase in top line revenue growth. The reason the other 9 don't is because it's really difficult to do. Now, technologies have moved on. AI is prevalent. Your testing is becoming easier. It still doesn't mean that marketers are good at it, but you can bring that insight into the commercial insight, link it to a case study where you've helped a client do testing effectively, and then use that to have a conversation about testing and optimization to qualify how much of a problem it is. And in its simplest form, you know, you could quite quickly get to a point where you've identified that that individual is losing 25% of revenue that you then form as the basis of the discussion going forward. But, you know, as you get deeper into the process and you're shaping the evaluation and you're wanting to build consensus with people that want more than just a conversation, you know, let's say the finance director or the CFO, for example, you have to build that out. And I think that is a process that I always took on as a sales leader, a sales rep as an individual, but also as a leader, to enable my teams to teach them how to successfully quantify the differentiating commercial value of the solution that we were providing, so that we could get to a point where we could create versions of, you know, we could tailor the approach depending on who the buyer or the coach or the champion, whoever you want to call it, needs to convince.
And so this is interesting because I promised listeners and viewers that we're going to dig into how you were able to quadruple average order value within just 12 months.
It's all linked.
It's all exactly, it's all linked. And I want to give them that structure. So why don't we dig into that? Because the mechanism by which you did that was to help the salespeople become more buyer-centric. What are the steps, or what are the things that are critical to helping a salesperson or a sales team become more buyer-centric? What are the things that they have to look into and do?
You know, and I know you're sort of talking about the quadrupling of average order value. There was a time when I led a new team into a new region, creating a new business unit or extending an existing business unit into a new region, where we together generated a business that went from 0 to $22 million ARR and several $1 million of services revenue within a 4-year period. You know, started with 1, and we had, you know, we were a team of 40 by the end of it. So when I think about that and that part in my career, with a responsibility that spanned sales, marketing, consulting to a certain degree, customer success, there was a lot of learnings in there that I took to the role where we then quadrupled average order value within our enterprise accounts. And so there were really sort of 2 pillars, 2 things that I focused on quite a lot, thought about every single day. One was community. And so you know, even at this time, you know, 7 years ago, sort of 3 to 7 years ago, this notion of buyers kind of retracting into the zone of resistance and hiding from sellers was already happening. I know we talk about it a lot today, but it started many years ago. And so I felt that if we were able to bring customers, prospects, and partners together in a safe environment where they were comfortable talking openly, and we made a point of not selling at them, but just connecting them, that had such a positive effect on the amount of business that we generated. And so, you know, we worked quite hard at doing that with a relatively small budget as well. The other thing is enablement. So, you know, not relying, because I was part of a big company then, so I didn't want to rely on our enablement team to do the enablement. I didn't want to rely on an external third party to do the enablement, because a lot of the approach that I'm talking about today was coming from me and my head based on what's worked in the past. And so, you know, it was key that I designed the enablement program. You know, I was able to get the support to then enable the team effectively and provide that ongoing coaching, that you know, sometimes daily coaching required to help our buyers successfully navigate that you know, purchase process.
So there were 2 pillars: the community and then the enablement. And you talked about doing your own coaching. How should sellers or even sales leaders listening to this start to create that for themselves? So if you could, maybe we start with the community part. So how did you create a safe community for your buyers to join and actively participate?
Yeah, well, it started off small. So we would organize dinners, and the dinners would grow. So that, you know, it went from a few of us having a dinner at a table in a restaurant to moving to sort of private dining, you know, where we could get 15, 20, 25 people. And the more people that were interested and that were coming along, we realized we needed to create something bigger, but we wanted to maintain that sort of intimate kind of setting, if you like. So it sort of grew over time. By the end of the 4th year, we were regularly getting 50, 60 people together and turning it into, you know, an exciting, you know, we started giving out prizes and awards, and we would still have the dinners, we, we weren't bothered about the fact that customers, prospects, and partners were coming together, even partners that competed against each other. That wasn't the reason why we were doing it. We were doing it because we wanted to just bring people together, and it just naturally grew into this thing that we hadn't expected at the time. And I often use a phrase, sell without selling. I used to use that a lot with my teams, and that's kind of what we were doing. Just bring people together, and the fact that they build rapport, and you're not selling at them, they're getting to know you, you're building trust. Now, that's harder to do now that we're all digital and a lot of teams are remote. And so, that kind of leads on to what I think we need to be doing in the future, which is learning how to walk digital corridors effectively. Social selling is a term that's been used a lot. And I think, like anything, people have their own idea about it. But I think it needs to be a methodology, a strategy that kind of overarches everything we do within sales, so that we can take ownership of our personal brand. We can amplify that confidently. We can consistently connect with people across all platforms, not just LinkedIn, all digital platforms. And we can learn, I think we need to learn how to write. We need to learn how to create content that helps us achieve what we spend so much time trying to achieve as salespeople, which is earn trusted advisor status. Because only then can you have a real intellectual connection with your buyer, and only then are you truly able to help coach them through that buying process. And so, how do you do that? Look like an expert on all of your digital assets. LinkedIn, Twitter, Guild, if you're using a networking platform or any other platform.
That's interesting. And you talked about the second pillar, which was the enablement, and you specifically talked about the coaching. Now, coaching is something that I think there's enough data out there to say and show why it's important. Unfortunately, sales managers, particularly frontline sales managers, for various reasons, are not able to effectively coach people. Some of which because actually they shouldn't have gone into the management role, or some are probably right for the management role, but they're not given the training and the tools and the guidance for how to coach and how to structure it and what to do in the moment. How have you approached coaching, and what advice can you give sales managers who are listening to us right now about how to effectively conduct coaching, and both on a strategic and a tactical level? I know this is a big topic, but if there's anything we can share with them, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, what's worked for me is coaching courses, going on coaching courses myself. We all have bad habits, and we all have pressures that affect our ability to coach effectively. One of which is the pressure of doing business and forecasting. That's probably the biggest negative pressure on being able to coach effectively. That's quite hard to do, because you have to disconnect yourself from the pressure of forecasting and revenue and think about the individual. And I can't say I'm an expert coach, but I can say that if I had regular training around coaching, and I spent the time speaking with one of my mentors or someone about how to coach effectively, the next conversation I had with my first line manager or rep, they would feel the positive effects of that. In fact, I remember one guy saying to me, "Have you just been on a training course?" Because I was asking him questions that he really enjoyed answering. He didn't care about the fact that I'd been on there. Well, he actually did. He liked the fact I'd been on the training course. So there's that. There's also, when I think about, enablement as a whole and improving average order value, the approach to coaching when I became a more senior leader was kind of twofold. It's what's the coaching program for the for my sales directors versus what's the coaching for the, you know, the boots on the ground per se, and how should my approach change with first line managers who then need to encourage, or I need to encourage and motivate them to have more of a coaching stance with their teams.
You obviously went on your own coaching course so that you can become a better coach, which is great. And you obviously made the distinction between, you know, you're obviously going to be a different coaching program for your frontline managers versus your managers of managers. Let's say if you're a frontline manager, because you did say before that sometimes you would have to coach every day. Now that doesn't sound very sustainable for the long term. So is there a particular structure for a coaching system that you found work very effectively? You know, is it once a month? Is it once a week? Is it triggered by certain events? What have you found work?
Yeah, so what worked most effectively is when we designed the sales process to be more buyer-centric. So, you know, those three milestones that I was talking about before, we mapped out what they were. I think we had 5. And within each milestone, we identified and understood 2 types of behaviors. There was the customer behaviors and the sales rep behaviors. And this process, whilst was geared towards winning new business, it was set up in such a way that it took into account the path to value. So beyond contract signature, it took into account the path to value for a customer being successful once they'd signed up as a customer. As a coach, it then became easier to coach reps against those milestones and those behaviors, both from their perspective, in terms of what they need to be doing, what they're in control of, that increases their probability of success, but equally what they need to then help their buyer do, the behaviors their buyers need to follow that increase their probability of success, so a successful purchase of the solution. If you define that, it then became far easier to coach the reps, and that would be weekly, I'd say, as a minimum, with then, you know, any deal coaching, specific deal coaching that was required based on, you know, things not going the right way, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wish we had more time to discuss this, and obviously these are very, very big topics. There were definitely some practical things that I think people can take away from this. There are a couple of questions I want to ask you, and you know, help people connect with you to learn more about your approach and learn more about how to become buyer-centric, particularly if they're in the martech world. So the first question I want to ask is, 3 books would you recommend that our viewers and listeners should absolutely read? Or you might say, actually, there are 3 people, experts, you know, who our viewers and listeners should definitely follow and learn from. What would your recommendations be?
So firstly, the book, and I'd say the book that helped me when times were most challenging is called 4DX, the 4 Disciplines of Execution. It looks at how you define your high impact activities. And despite the whirlwind of chaos that we're in every single day, you focus on those high impact activities because they're the things that will get you closer to your objective. If you're familiar with the story of Sisyphus that kept pushing the rock up the hill time and time and time again, you know, doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, and expecting a different result, it's just a waste of time. So we often need to step back and think about what are those high impact activities that we need to be doing that will increase our probability of success. And don't rely on yourself, bring others into that conversation, bring your leadership team into the conversation. And that book, I bought the audio book. I think it's 20 hours, 25 hours of audio. I must have listened to 100 times. and I taught myself how to do that. And I'd recommend that as one of the top books on my list. Challenger, but the Challenger customer. So you touched on earlier about building consensus individually. I was a very successful solution seller years ago doing that. But when the magic kind of starts to happen, when you're in more control of your success, it's when you're either in the room building consensus with the decision-making unit, or you've successfully coached the buyer to do that job in the room with that decision-making unit. So I'd recommend the Challenger Customer, Brent Adamson. And then finally, social selling. So, I've now become a social selling an influence coach, an expert, successfully doing that myself. I've grown my own business 122% in the last 12 months as a result of it. And so Tim Hughes, and he's just written a new book actually that's available for pre-order on Amazon, called Social Selling: Techniques to Influence Buyers and Change Makers. So I recommend people go out and grab that book.
Yeah, those are some good recommendations. I hadn't read the 4DX or Social Selling, actually. I think it's on my bookshelf, but I haven't gotten around to it. So thank you for sharing those. How can our viewers and listeners connect with you, learn more about you, and get in touch?
The socials, so LinkedIn, Twitter, WhatsApp me, call me. All of my contact details are on LinkedIn in my contact section. So I'd love to chat to anyone interested in these topics.
Alex, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and great to talk to you about what made you and your team successful when it came to becoming buyer-centric, and how you use that to actually increase average order value and increase success of your sales team. So it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Great, thank you. And this is Moeed signing out. If any of viewers and listeners on the show are interested in the neuroscience and the psychology behind sales, and especially behind buying behaviors, and the what and how and why people make decisions so that they can inform their sales process and basically lift the bar on every metric related to sales, then please get in touch with me. Happy to discuss more about that. Links in the show notes below. But until the next episode, thank you very much.